My name is Lila Hart, I'm 29 years old, and I should have died that night on the subway platform. I had left the office late because a client call ran long, and because I told myself I could afford the extra hours. I told myself 1,000 tiny truths to justify staying at my desk until the city outside was mostly strangers and neon. The station smelled like rain and old metal, the benches slick with the ghost of rush hour breath. I remember the tilt of the fluorescent lights and how the sound of the tracks seemed to live under everything like a constant, low pulse. I remember thinking I was tired in the way people are tired when they've been winning small battles all week. Not the kind of exhaustion that rewires life, just a soft ache behind the eyes. Then he appeared near the platform edge, a silhouette in a dark suit, his hands in his pockets like he belonged to the architecture of the place rather than the bodies that used it. I noticed him because he moved too deliberately, and when a man moves like that in a crowd that is usually careless, my skin pricked. Our eyes met for a second that felt too long. There was no recognition, only a flash of something flat and clinical in his gaze, as if I were an object he'd just inventoried and decided how to discard. I told myself it was paranoia and kept my steps measured, clutching my bag as if it were an anchor. He came closer. I thought he would pass. He didn't. He shoved me, hard enough that the air left my lungs and the world pitched sideways. My knees buckled and the platform's edge became a frame I didn't expect to fall through. Time telescoped into a narrow tunnel of noise, a metallic grind, the scream that erupts from a throat when the body registers impossible speed, the chorus of voices that turn from conversation to alarm in the span of one breath. The reason I'm writing this is not to dramatize the physics of it but to name the absurd, surviving fact. I didn't fall under the train. I rolled into the tiny safety groove beneath the lip of the platform, a shallow, filthy trench that somehow saved my life by a hair's breadth and left me looking up at shoes and faces and a man who, a second earlier, had decided to end me. He was gone when I hauled myself out, like a ghost who had finished his work. People were gathered, shouting into phones, pointing, offering hands I couldn't take because my legs felt like someone else's. The train thundered on as if nothing had happened. The paramedics asked questions I couldn't answer. The police took statements that blurred into each other. I remember the ambulance's antiseptic smell, the way the fluorescent lights inside it seemed to strip color from everything, including the surge of rage that arrived right after the fear. I remember making a promise in the siren's echo. If he thought he'd severed me from the world, he'd been wrong. I remember lying in my hospital bed with a throbbing bruise across my ribs and realizing the thing that kept me awake wasn't the pain, but the fact that the man who had shoved me had walked away and could be out there living tidy, ordinary life people assume after they leave a subway station. I remember the investigators shrugging, the surveillance footage being grainy, the station cameras angled in that cheap, indifferent way. Public systems record everything but nothing that matters. I remember my friends saying it could have been a random act, that I was lucky, that the city has its horrors and no one can predict them. I remember, too, the angry animal certainty that rose up like bile in my throat. Whoever he was, whatever his motive, he had chosen me in a moment when my back was turned to safety. The idea of random felt like a lie, because nothing in the way he looked at me that split second read like anything other than intent. I left the hospital with bruises that would fade and a ledger of questions that would not. I started going back to the station, not because I wanted to be brave, but because I had to see the place where the world had decided I could keep living. I started noticing patterns. The angle of his shoulders when he walked, the way certain suits hung on his frame, how a small scar at the top of his hand caught the light. I told myself I would not let this be the end of the sentence he tried to write over me. That night, I swore I'd find him and make him wish I hadn't survived. People think trauma fades with time, but his face haunted me like a stain on memory. Every night, I saw that same moment before the shove, the pale light of the station. His eyes, sharp and emotionless. The way his hand lingered near his side, as though he'd rehearsed the movement 1,000 times. The sound of my own scream kept replaying, looping until it no longer sounded like me at all. The police closed the case after 2 weeks. No viable leads, they said. The grainy footage didn't show his face clearly enough to identify him. He had been clever or just lucky choosing a blind spot, wearing a simple black suit that could belong to 100 men. To them, I was just another victim of urban violence. To me, I was unfinished business. At first, I tried to move on. I told myself I'd go back to work, pick up my projects, drink wine with friends, pretend to laugh at things that didn't matter. But I couldn't sit in a subway car without my throat tightening. The sound of brakes on steel made my stomach lurch. Every stranger's glance felt like his, as if he were hidden behind 1,000 ordinary faces. I stopped taking the train altogether. I started walking everywhere, always watching reflections in windows, scanning crowds for that same cruel calmness. Obsession crept in quietly. It didn't arrive with anger but with logic, the kind that whispers, "You're not crazy, you're right." I began to map out the timeline of that night, frame by frame. The color of his tie. The smell of expensive cologne. The slight limp in his right leg when he turned away. I listed every detail in a small leather notebook. I read survivor forums, cold case articles, even psychological reports on violent offenders. I wasn't hunting a random attacker. I was tracing the outline of a man who believed he could erase me. Weeks turned into months, and still, he lingered in my head. One gray morning in early spring, I stopped at a cafe across from the station, the same cafe I used to pass every day before the attack. I was halfway through my coffee when I saw him. I don't know how I knew instantly, maybe it was the way he adjusted his cufflinks. Or how his jaw tightened when he checked his watch. The world around me blurred. My pulse surged in my ears. It was him. The man who shoved me. He was alive, calm, well-dressed, and apparently unbothered by the fact that he had once tried to kill me. I froze, unable to breathe for a full 10 seconds. Then, something inside me steadied. I followed him. He walked with confidence, the kind that only comes from knowing you belong somewhere important. He stopped in front of a tall glass building downtown. The silver letters on the side spelled out Cole and Havers Law Associates. He stepped inside. I waited until he disappeared behind the security desk before crossing the street. My reflection in the door looked pale but determined. Inside the lobby, I checked the digital directory. Nathan, Cole senior partner. Nathan. The name rolled off my tongue like poison. I scribbled it in my notebook. When I got home, I searched everything I could find. Nathan Cole, 35, corporate lawyer, specialized in mergers and acquisitions. Married to Elise Cole, a charity director, father of one, a picture-perfect life. A smiling family portrait on the firm's website made my blood turn cold. There he was, the man who pushed me onto the tracks, standing beside his wife and daughter, looking like a model citizen. That night, I stared at his photo until my eyes burned. The anger that had slept in me for months roared awake. I wanted to tear down everything he built, piece by piece, until he felt what it was like to lose control, to lose safety, certainty, peace. I thought about calling the police again, but what could I say? That I recognized a man from a half-second glance in a crowd months ago? They would dismiss me again. They already had. So I started watching him. I learned his schedule, what time he left home, when he arrived at work, which gym he visited on Tuesdays, which bar he preferred after long days. I told myself it wasn't stalking, it was research. I wasn't seeking vengeance yet. I was collecting truth. Sometimes, as I watched him through my camera lens, I wondered if he remembered me at all. Did my face ever flicker in his mind? Did he replay that night? Or had it meant nothing, just a moment of impulse? A spark of cruelty that left me broken while he moved on without a second thought. That possibility enraged me most. I caught glimpses of his private life, the subtle distance between him and his wife, the way he smiled at other women when she wasn't looking. The empty arrogance of a man who believed his world was untouchable. Each discovery made my conviction stronger. Late one evening, I stood outside his building as the city lights reflected off the glass, the wind sharp against my skin. From across the street, I watched him step into a black car, phone pressed to his ear, laughing about something. That sound, that carefree laugh, was the trigger I didn't know I was waiting for. My fear dissolved, replaced by a quiet, burning clarity. The man who tried to kill me lived a perfect life until I decided to become his shadow. Every monster has a routine, and I made it my job to learn his. Once I knew Nathan's name, the world seemed to rearrange itself around that knowledge. The city became a grid of his habits, every intersection another piece of his daily rhythm. I woke early to follow his morning jogs through Riverside Park. He wore the same navy tracksuit, the same earbuds, the same measured stride. On some mornings, I'd stand behind a newspaper stand, pretending to read while my camera recorded the pattern of his movement. He was disciplined, meticulous, the kind of man who thought control was a virtue. After his runs, he stopped by a cafe 2 blocks from his law firm, always ordering black coffee and a croissant. The barista knew his name, his order, his favorite table by the window. He'd sit there, scrolling through his phone, his reflection framed perfectly in the glass. I would sit across the street with my laptop open, pretending to work while I memorized his expressions. He looked calm, collected, so painfully ordinary that it made me wonder if I'd imagined the night on the tracks. But then, I'd remember the feeling of his hands against my back, the cold shock of air as I fell, and doubt would evaporate like mist. I built a folder on my computer called Cole. It contained photos, screenshots, notes, everything I learned about him. His routines became my schedule. His comfort became my curriculum. I found his gym membership through an online forum his firm had sponsored, and from there, his secondary email address. With a few searches, I uncovered public charity events, conferences, client meetings, all neatly documented by social media posts that celebrated his dedication and excellence. People loved him. They called him dependable, charming, professional. The kind of man no one would believe capable of violence. It disgusted me, but it also fueled me. The bigger the image, the harder it would fall. He lived in a townhouse in Midtown, beautiful and expensive, the kind of home that smelled of money and privilege. Through a professional networking site, I learned about his wife, Elise. She ran a non-profit that helped single mothers find employment. She looked genuine, the kind of person whose smile came from kindness, not performance. They had a daughter, maybe 6 or 7, with her mother's eyes and his crooked grin. I told myself I wasn't interested in them, but that was a lie. The family portrait was part of the fortress that protected him, and I needed to understand every wall before I could take one down. At night, I would sit in my small apartment, replaying the footage I'd captured during the day. His gestures, his posture, his arrogance. He liked to look at himself in reflective surfaces, windows, mirrors, polished metal. He admired himself constantly, even when no one else was watching. That was how I knew he hadn't changed. The man who shoved me onto those tracks wasn't acting out of rage or panic. He had done it because he could. Because in his mind, people like me, small, exhausted, invisible, didn't matter. Weeks passed before he ever noticed me. One afternoon, I followed him into a bookstore. I kept my distance, staying near the art section while he browsed business titles. For a moment, his gaze swept across the room and landed on me. My heart froze, but he didn't linger. He didn't recognize me. To him, I was just another stranger in a city full of them. That realization filled me with both relief and fury. He'd nearly killed me, and I was forgettable. That night, I began sketching out plans not just for vengeance but for exposure. I wanted him to lose everything. Not through violence, but through truth. I started reading about his firm's high-profile cases, searching for anything that smelled like corruption. Lawyers like Nathan always had skeletons hidden in polished closets, and I would find them. I rented a small studio near his office under a false name. It wasn't luxurious, but it gave me a vantage point. I could see the building from my window, could watch him come and go. I began to track patterns in his behavior when he lingered too long on his phone outside, when he met someone in the alley for hushed conversations, when he returned late at night, face tight with anger. Slowly, a picture began to form. Nathan wasn't just arrogant, he was reckless when he thought no one was watching. My obsession hardened into discipline. Every file I gathered, every timestamp, every photo became ammunition. I knew this kind of revenge would take time, and patience was something I had learned in the aftermath of trauma. I wasn't the same woman he had shoved onto the tracks. That version of me had died that night. The one who replaced her was colder, deliberate, capable of waiting years if necessary. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I wondered who I was becoming. I told myself it was justice, not vengeance. But justice never felt this intoxicating. Watching him lose the smallest comforts, the illusion of safety, the ease of routine became a secret satisfaction. I imagined him sensing the cracks but not yet knowing why. The first time I saw him lose composure, it was a small thing. He dropped his coffee while reading something on his phone, cursed under his breath, and stormed out of the cafe. That single moment, that flicker of control slipping, was enough to make me smile for the first time in months. It meant he was human after all. And humans could break. Because when I strike, I want him to lose everything, not just once, but piece by piece. To destroy Nathan, I had to understand the woman who loved him. I told myself this with the clinical calm of someone mapping terrain before an operation. Elise Cole was not collateral, she was an axis. If Nathan's life were a building, Elise was the pillar that held up the facade, the smiling center that made his lies look like kindness. I needed to see how the pillar attached to the beams. I needed to know where to loosen the bolts. I found the charity she ran listed on a community board and volunteered under a name I'd used before. Simple, believable, a person with a soft past and available time. The office smelled of lemon cleaner and paper. The women who worked there moved gently, the way people do when they're used to mending other people's brittle lives. Elise arrived on a Wednesday with a tote bag full of paperwork and a laugh that sounded like sunlight. Up close, she was smaller than she looked in the photos on Nathan's firm website, and there was a weariness around her eyes that made her tenderness feel earned. I let her draw me in. I let her tell me about the mothers she helped and the children she worried about and the nights she lay awake thinking about what more she could do. I smiled in the right places and nodded at the right confessions, offering the kind of listening that feels like shelter. Trust, when you want it, is a fragile and greedy thing. Elise gave it away as if she believed it could fix people. I used that generosity against her, not with malice at first, but with a surgeon's precision. I asked questions that seemed small: how long she'd been married, whether Nathan traveled much for work, if he had secrets that kept him from sleeping. Her answers came soft and quick. Nathan was dedicated, proactive, stressed lately about a merger, always promising to be better. There were pauses in her sentences where she corrected herself, quick apologies. I pressed gently into those pauses and discovered what she didn't say out loud: the exhaustion that comes from loving someone who gives himself to the world and not to you. We started having coffee after volunteer shifts. I learned the cadence of her week: board meetings on Mondays, client outreach on Thursdays, family nights on Sundays. She called Nathan my anchor in moments of anxious tenderness, but she also admitted his distance with a laugh that ended like a question. I floated hints into conversations that sounded like concern, the kind of seeding a friend does when she thinks she's protecting someone. Sometimes distance is a clue, not an excuse, I said, casual. I know it's hard, she replied, and sighed. I didn't love what I was doing then. I loved the efficacy of it. Elise told me about the charity gala coming up and how Nathan had promised to be there but had meetings that might pull him away. She confided about small embarrassments in their marriage, late dinners, empty promises, and I let a pattern form in her mind that I'd helped outline, speaking only truths she could connect herself. In private, I began dropping anonymous notes, photos of Nathan at a bar with a woman who wasn't Elise, bills in his name that didn't match their family narrative, subtle reminders that the man she loved had skirts of darkness around the edges. I watched the bruises of doubt bloom where I'd planted my seeds, a text she couldn't ignore, a question she tried not to ask him. I filmed Nathan once when he stormed out of a charity meeting, his jaw clenched, slamming a door I knew Elise had also walked through. I watched the footage in my tiny apartment and let my chest tighten at the sight of him raising his voice at her in private, a way he never did in public where his image mattered. There were nights I lay awake wrestling with the arithmetic of it. Did I have the right to dismantle her devotion even if he deserved ruin? The answer that came back steady was that Elise deserved the truth, even if it hurt. If love was a house built on deception, she had the right to know its foundations. The proximity of our growing friendship tasted like a dangerous mercy. I was taking advantage of someone's kindness so I could cut the rope of a different kindness that had been used to strangle me. It didn't make me feel noble, it made me feel necessary. One evening, weeks into our friendship, Elise invited me over for dinner, as if offering normalcy after a long day. Nathan was late. They ate in silence for a stretch long enough that the air between them curdled. I watched Elise reach across the table to Sedge, touch his hand. He withdrew it as if burned. Later, when he thought she'd gone to bed, I caught him on the hallway camera from across the street, furious and reaching for his phone with hands that shook. He didn't see me. Elise texted me the next morning with a simple, raw line. "Do you ever feel like you're the only one trying?" My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could have lied, reassured her, told her to trust the man she loved. Instead, I sent her the photo of Nathan with the other woman and nothing else. The message landed like a small meteor in her life. She called him that night, and the conversation that followed was the first crack I'd been waiting for. That's when I knew I wouldn't just expose Nathan's lies, I'd free her from them. It started small, a whisper, a rumor, a carefully placed seed of doubt. Revenge, I'd learned, didn't have to arrive with thunder. Sometimes it was quieter, like smoke slipping through a keyhole, unseen until it filled the room. Elise's discovery of the photo was the first fissure. After that night, the rhythm of Nathan's world began to falter. I could see it in the way he carried himself, shoulders drawn tighter, glances sharper, as though he could sense the invisible hand tugging at the threads of his perfect life. A week after Elise confronted him, I saw him leaving their townhouse in the early morning, jaw clenched, tie askew. He looked less like a man in control and more like one outrunning a story that refused to stay buried. From the cafe across the street, I watched him argue on the phone, his voice raised, gestures jagged. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. His confidence, that arrogant composure that once seemed unshakable, was beginning to crack. I started feeding his downfall in doses. I sent an anonymous email to the senior partners at his firm, attaching the same photos I'd sent Elise, accompanied by a carefully worded note. Your partner's conduct may reflect poorly on your firm's reputation. Consider investigating before the press does. Lawyers hate scandal. They fear headlines more than guilt. Within 2 days, Nathan's smiling face disappeared from the firm's website. His suspension was quiet, internal, the kind of punishment powerful men suffer before they can spin the story. But I saw the tremor it caused. He showed up at the office anyway, desperate to prove control, only to be escorted out by security. The image of him standing on the sidewalk, fists tight at his sides while people watched through glass doors, filled me with something dangerously close to joy. I didn't stop there. I created anonymous social media accounts and began to leak bits of gossip, subtle, believable pieces that merged truth with fiction. I wrote that Nathan Cole had ongoing affairs, that he'd falsified documents in previous mergers, that he was under investigation for misconduct. Each rumor found traction because of his reputation for arrogance. People didn't need proof, they needed a reason to believe what they already suspected. The world began to respond to the narrative I was crafting. His clients started pulling contracts. The firm issued a statement about temporary leave. Elise stopped attending public events with him. I watched it all unfold from a distance, detached yet electrified. Every small fracture in his image felt like a return of my own breath, one gasp at a time. I thought, briefly, about stopping there. About letting him suffer in silence, stripped of respect, his name dragged through quiet corridors. But revenge, once it begins to breathe, is not easily smothered. It becomes a rhythm of its own, a drumbeat that refuses to fade. One night, I followed him to a dimly lit bar near the river. He sat alone, drink after drink, his reflection in the window blurred by rain. The man who had once walked through the world like a king now looked like he was drowning in his own reflection. When he finally left, he stumbled slightly, muttering something under his breath. I stayed behind, watching the condensation slide down his empty glass, and wondered if he could feel me, the ghost he'd made by trying to erase me. Days later, he began showing up outside Elise's charity, waiting for her to leave, trying to explain, trying to win her back. She ignored him, at first. Then she shouted. I recorded the confrontation from my car. Her voice cracked with fury and humiliation, his with desperation. That footage, too, found its way to the right inboxes. Another small leak. Another chip in his mask. But beneath my satisfaction, something darker began to stir, not guilt, not pity, but awareness. Nathan was unraveling too quickly. A man like him doesn't crumble quietly, he fights. He had the eyes of someone cornered, and I knew from experience what cornered men were capable of. The subway night had proved that. I started to feel the faint tremor of fear again, not for my life this time, but for what I was becoming in the name of survival. Each morning, I'd wake to a new headline or whisper about Nathan Cole's indefinite leave, or domestic trouble. My plan was working. But in the mirror, my reflection was harder to recognize. The circles under my eyes darkened. The cold satisfaction in my chest began to feel heavy. Still, I told myself it was worth it. Every sleepless night, every false name, every manipulated truth, they were all part of the justice I'd been denied. I stood outside his office one last time, camera hidden beneath my coat, watching him storm past his former colleagues without acknowledgement. His eyes were bloodshot, his steps uneven. He looked broken. For the first time, I wondered if he remembered the woman on the tracks, if somewhere behind that hollow stare, he knew I was the one dismantling his life. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Because if he did know, he wouldn't forgive it. A man like Nathan didn't accept defeat, he plotted it. And as much as I told myself I was in control, something inside whispered that he was beginning to sense the pattern, the rhythm of my revenge closing in around him. But what I didn't realize was that he had already started to suspect me. One night, I felt it, that eerie certainty of being watched. It started like a whisper at the back of my neck. Footsteps that matched my pace and then fell behind. A car idling too long at the corner. The soft click of a camera shutter when I was sure I was alone. At first I told myself it was paranoia, the natural recoil of someone who'd tasted violence and would never be wholly certain again. Then the little things stacked up into a pleading ledger of evidence. I walked home one evening and the hallway light outside my building was already on, though I always flipped it myself. My keys fit the lock like they always had, but the door stuck a fraction of an inch, as if someone had pushed it from the inside. Inside my kitchen lay a single playing card, the jack of spades, on the counter where I always set my mail. I swallowed and understood the message even before I turned the card over. My bathtub drain had been cleared of hair. I was certain I'd left there. My phone received calls with nothing but breath on the line at 3 a.m. I chalked some of it up to city shadows. Some of it aligned into a shape I couldn't ignore. Then I found the note on my kitchen table, typed on cheap paper in a font that suggested indifference rather than threat. You should have died that night. The words were not creative, but they were precise enough to slice the room into before and after. A cold, animal ratchet of fear wound through me and locked into place. I called the police. They took another report and advised vigilance. I laughed at the advice in my head, at how the same institution that shrugged at my attempt to identify the man who shoved me now suggested I change my locks and ask a neighbor to check on me. Their concern felt like a bandage on a gunshot. I burned through the cautionary list I'd kept for months and realized how exposed I remained. An apartment registered under my real name. A phone number tied to old accounts. An email address that could be traced to me with a few clicks. If Nathan was watching and I no longer had the luxury of denying it, then he was more organized than I'd thought. Panic flexed, then gave way to the part of me that had become expert in survival. I began by erasing footprints, exhaustive deletion of social profiles, changing passwords in a fever, withdrawing the little digital breadcrumbs that had made tracking him possible. I opened new burner accounts under names I had practiced for this exact moment. I rented a P.O. box instead of receiving parcels, bought a cheap prepaid phone, and started using cash for the small things. The erasure felt like shedding skin. It also felt like surrender. I hired a locksmith, changed the locks, installed cameras that fed to a private hard drive. I slept in short bursts and learned to listen to the city like a dog listens for predators. Yet the note had done its work. It planted doubt like a toothache. Who among the men I'd exposed could reach this far? Who among them had the arrogance or the cruelty to remind me that he had the power to finish what he'd started? I thought immediately of Nathan, and that thought made bile rise in my throat because I had banked everything on his humiliation, not his retaliation. If he had known enough to send that note, then he had narrowed the circle. He had, perhaps, connected some of the leaks back to me. My hands moved quicker, meaner. I scrubbed metadata from files, rerouted any traces I could, and took steps to misdirect. I planted a false trail pointing to a Reddit account and a disgruntled former employee from his firm, then watched anonymously as investigators private and otherwise chased ghosts. A cowardly thing to do, but then survival demanded cunning. The more proactive I became, the more the dynamic shifted. No longer was I merely the hunter, I could feel the hunter's gaze tighten and change shape. He made mistakes now. A car idling where he shouldn't. A presence at the coffee shop that didn't fit the rhythm of strangers. He wanted me to show myself. To respond to fear with irrational action. He wanted to make me small again. Instead, I closed ranks and planned a different kind of attack, controlled, surgical, inattentive to spectacle. I would not let him drag me back into chaos by his threats. I learned to sleep with one ear on the city, one eye on the cameras, my palms always within reach of the pepper spray I kept in my pocket. I took self-defense classes not to learn how to fight him that could be lethal for both of us, but to rebuild a body that didn't flinch at sounds. Weeks later, a new clue arrived. A photo slid under my door in the middle of the night, glossy and expensive, showing me in the cafe where I'd first seen Nathan, taken from an angle that suggested someone had followed me from a distance and had the patience to wait for the right frame. Written on the back in a different hand were 3 words: stop or else. The rules had changed. The hunter had turned his attention from subtle terror to overt warning, and with that shift came the cruel arithmetic of escalation. I could run, disappear to another city, change my name legally, and fade into a life without the small comforts I once had. Or I could face it, sharpen my plan, and close whatever door linked him to my life. I chose the latter, because cowardice would have let him win without effort. There was one thing I hadn't yet done. Show him that I knew how to rewrite the rules of fear. He knows I'm alive, but not who I am not yet. Revenge stopped being about justice, it became art. After the note and the photo, fear and fury merged into something sharper. I realized Nathan wasn't going to stop until one of us broke. So I made it my purpose to ensure it wouldn't be me. The police could do nothing. Friends had drifted from my life long ago, unable to understand the cold persistence that had replaced my warmth. I was alone, but so was he now, and that was the first thread I could pull. I began where he was weakest, his ego. Men like Nathan didn't crumble under physical pain, they disintegrated under the weight of humiliation. Through Elise, I still had access to fragments of his world. Her charity had recently ended their marriage officially. The divorce papers had been filed quietly, but I'd read between the lines of public records. She'd taken their daughter and moved to a smaller home outside the city. Nathan had tried to spin the story into one of irreconcilable differences, but whispers had already spread through his firm. The moment his colleagues began to suspect him of deceit, I knew I had the leverage I needed. From one of my old burner accounts, I slipped past the firm's firewall. It wasn't as hard as I expected. Arrogance leaves doors unlocked. Once inside, I discovered his email archives, a network of self-importance and backdoor deals. I copied everything: his private conversations with clients, his payment records, his attempts to manipulate negotiations. I forged a few carefully chosen emails, subtly implying that Nathan had leaked confidential information about a client's merger in exchange for personal favors. Then I forwarded those messages from his own address to a journalist who had covered corporate scandals before. It didn't take long for the storm to begin. The article hit the business section of a major online paper within a week. Senior partner implicated in possible data breach, internal inquiry underway. Nathan's photo sat beside the headline, his confident smile now a symbol of deceit. His firm issued a vague statement about ongoing investigation, but I could see the panic in the way his online presence shifted: deactivated accounts, new privacy settings, desperate attempts to erase a digital trail already burned into the internet. Next, I turned my attention to his personal life. Using another alias, I texted Elise from a disposable number. The message was short, calculated to pierce. He never stopped lying. Check the date of his last business trip and the hotel charges. She didn't reply, but I didn't need her to. A few days later, I saw her confronting him in front of their old home, her voice raised, tears streaking down her face. I filmed from a distance, my lens steady while his mask cracked in full view of the world. The video found its way onto a neighborhood gossip page. From there, it spread. The perfect husband was now the cheating liar, the corporate snake, the man who'd lost his family and career. I'd expected satisfaction, but what I felt was closer to adrenaline, bright, clean, unstoppable. Every move I made sent another wave of consequences into his life. He stopped jogging in the mornings. He stopped appearing at the cafe. His friends avoided him. When I saw him next, his suit was wrinkled, his hair unkempt. He looked like a ghost trapped inside his own reputation. But even ghosts can fight back. One night, I noticed my cameras had been tampered with. The feeds flickered, as if someone had tested them. I double-checked my locks, confirmed the files were safe. Still, the message was clear. He was trying to reassert control. The battle wasn't over, it had simply changed terrain. I decided to push harder. I leaked more documents to the press, mixing true information with subtle fabrications that would take months to unravel. I sent anonymous complaints to the firm's board accusing Nathan of tax fraud, bribery, and manipulation of clients. The accusations were baseless, but they didn't need to be real to destroy him, they only needed to sound plausible. His suspension, it turned into termination within days. When I saw him again, it was by accident. He was sitting alone in a park near the river, the same one where he used to run. His eyes were hollow, his posture slack. He was drinking straight from a bottle, staring into the dark water as if waiting for it to answer. For a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. Then I remembered the sound of the train screaming past my head that night, the terror, the helplessness. My sympathy evaporated. He deserved every ounce of ruin. But as I turned to leave, a reflection in a nearby window caught me off guard. My own face thinner, harder, colder. There was no satisfaction in it anymore, just the residue of obsession. Revenge had consumed so much of me that I wasn't sure what would remain when it ended. I wasn't just dismantling his world. I was stripping myself of the softness that once defined me. That night, I dreamed of the subway again. The lights flickering, the wind roaring through the tunnel. Only this time, I wasn't the one falling. Nathan was. And I was standing above, watching, silent. I woke with my heart pounding and my throat dry, the taste of victory and horror intertwined. But revenge, I was about to learn, doesn't end neatly. It devours everything, even its maker. The more he lost, the more I lost myself. When I first began dismantling Nathan's life, I told myself it was justice. Now, as I stared at the wreckage, his career in ruins, his marriage ended, his face plastered across gossip sites, I realized I'd built a cage I was also trapped inside. Every notification, every headline, every whispered rumor felt like proof that I still lived in his orbit. I couldn't stop checking for updates, couldn't stop verifying that his suffering continued. It had become my pulse. Sleep abandoned me completely. I'd lie awake for hours, watching the city lights crawl across my ceiling, replaying the night at the subway station over and over. But the memory had changed. Sometimes I saw him shoving me. Other times, I saw myself shoving him. I didn't know which version frightened me more. My phone buzzed constantly, alerts about the scandal. Messages from burner accounts I'd created to seed the chaos. I'd built 1,000 masks to destroy one man. And now they all stared back at me, faceless and accusing. Elise texted me one evening, the message brief but heavy. "Thank you for showing me who he really was." I wish I'd seen it sooner. The words should have brought relief, but instead they made my stomach twist. She had no idea that the stranger she thanked was the same woman who'd once watched her life like a movie reel, calculating every frame. I typed a reply, "You deserve peace," and deleted it before sending. I didn't deserve to be her friend. Guilt crept in like water through cracks. I tried to drown it by reminding myself of his crimes. I told myself he'd nearly killed me, that his suffering was a small price for the terror he'd inflicted. But guilt is stubborn. It doesn't vanish when logic demands it to. It lingers in the quiet, whispering that you've gone too far. Then, one morning, I opened my inbox to find an email from an untraceable address. No subject line, no greeting. Just a single message. You won. Happy now? My heart stopped. I knew it was him. The tone was restrained. Deliberate, a man trying to sound calm when everything around him was burning. I should have ignored it. I should have deleted it immediately. But curiosity is a dangerous currency, I replied. You should have thought of that before you pushed me. An hour later, his response arrived. You think I don't remember? I remember everything. But I didn't mean to. I was drunk. It wasn't personal. Drunk. The word made my skin crawl. It wasn't personal, as if that excused the attempt on my life. I stared at the screen, shaking. He went on. You survived. I've been living with that guilt. Every day. I saw your face again in every headline, every nightmare. I thought maybe you'd never remember mine. I guess I was wrong. For a moment, I almost pitied him. The confession sounded genuine, remorseful even. But then, at the bottom of the email, came one final line that changed everything. If you think I'll go down alone, you're wrong. The words detonated inside me. I read them again and again, each time colder than the last. He wasn't apologizing, he was warning me. If he'd pieced together that I was behind his downfall, he had nothing left to lose. And desperate men are dangerous. I spent the next hours deleting everything: files, emails, burner accounts. I wiped hard drives, destroyed memory cards, burned every paper trail that could connect me to him. I even erased the video of his shove from the night of the attack, the only proof I had. I told myself I didn't need it anymore. What I needed was distance. But distance is easier to imagine than to create. His presence clung to me like smoke. Even when I stepped outside, I could feel eyes on me. The city had become a labyrinth of paranoia. I stopped answering calls from unknown numbers. I changed apartments again, this time to a small, windowless place on the outskirts of town. I lived in silence, sustained by takeout and bottled water, my life shrinking down to 4 walls and a single locked door. At night, I dreamed of him. Not the man who pushed me, but the version I'd built, broken, furious, vengeful. In some dreams, he begged for forgiveness. In others, he watched from across a subway platform, smiling as the train lights washed over him. I'd wake up gasping, convinced I could still smell the metal of the tracks. Days blurred into one another. I stopped checking the news, stopped writing, stopped caring about anything beyond survival. Then, as if summoned by the quiet, another message arrived. This time, a video. No sender listed, no metadata. Just a single clip. I hesitated before opening it. The video was short, less than 10 seconds. It showed a dark street corner. Rain falling in sheets. The camera tilted up just enough for me to recognize the building, my old apartment, the one I'd fled months ago. The focus adjusted, zoomed in slowly, and there, standing beneath the streetlight, was him. Nathan. Looking straight at the lens. Then the video cut to black. My hands went numb. He wasn't gone. He was reminding me that he could find me whenever he wanted. The roles had reversed again. I wasn't the hunter anymore. I was prey. That night, I sat in my small apartment, the air thick with panic, and I realized something I'd been avoiding. I had spent so long orchestrating his ruin that I no longer knew how to live without him. Revenge had fused us together in ways that neither of us could undo. Until I saw the final sentence. If you think I'll go down alone, you're wrong. His threat wasn't empty. He wanted to drag me into the fire with him. When I read that last line of his email, the room seemed to tilt. It wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. Nathan wasn't finished. I'd taken everything from him. His job, his reputation, his family, and now he wanted to return the favor. He wasn't going to come after me with fists or knives. No, Nathan Cole was smarter than that. He was going to use the one weapon I'd underestimated, the truth twisted in his favor. It began subtly. I started receiving messages from law enforcement official-looking emails requesting clarification on harassment complaints I'd allegedly filed. Then came the calls. The polite but firm voices asking if I had been in contact with Nathan recently. Each one chipped at my sanity until I understood what was happening. He was building a case against me, a mirror version of the one I'd built against him. The first report accused me of stalking, of sending threatening messages to a former associate. The second detailed digital interference, alleging that I'd hacked into confidential files. He'd taken every crime I'd committed and preemptively reported it as his own victimization. I could almost admire the strategy. Almost. I had to stay ahead of him. I began to rebuild what I'd destroyed: backups of emails, photos, timestamps, proof that his actions had always preceded mine. But I couldn't bring those to the police. I'd crossed too many lines already. If I tried to expose him again, they'd find everything. The forged emails, the anonymous leaks, the digital footprints I thought I'd erased. Nathan had backed me into the same corner I'd once shoved him into. The night after the second police call, I came home to find the faint scent of cologne in my hallway, his cologne, sharp and citrusy. My stomach dropped. I turned on every light in the apartment, moving from room to room with shaking hands. Nothing was missing. But on my kitchen counter, beneath a single beam of light, lay a flash drive. No note this time. Just that small, silent object waiting for me to decide whether I wanted to know what was inside. It took me an hour to gather the courage. When I finally plugged it in, the folder opened to reveal video files. Surveillance footage, my own. Stolen from the cameras I'd installed around the apartment months earlier. Each clip was dated, each one showing me pacing, working, sleeping. He'd hacked into my system, recorded my life, and now he wanted me to see that he had been watching me all along. I closed the laptop, bile burning my throat. I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed what I could carry: a few clothes, cash, my fake IDs, and left before dawn. The city felt hostile in its silence. I walked for hours, blending into early commuters, before checking into a cheap motel under another alias. The air smelled of bleach and fear, but it was anonymous. That was enough. For 2 days, I did nothing but plan. I mapped every connection. Nathan still had ex-colleagues, acquaintances, a few former clients who owed him favors. I created a web of names and decided where to cut. If he wanted to expose me, I'd make sure no one believed him. I crafted new accounts, this time pretending to be him. I sent cryptic messages to his former partners, implying he was planning to release confidential firm data. I leaked fragments of fake documents suggesting he'd embezzled funds before his termination. Chaos layered on chaos, each lie reinforcing the illusion that Nathan Cole was spiraling out of control. But revenge, I'd learned, has diminishing returns. Every time I tried to erase him, he grew sharper, more dangerous. The next blow came through an unexpected source: my landlord from the old apartment. He called, his tone strained. "Someone came by asking questions about you," he said he was with the police. My blood ran cold. I knew it was Nathan. He was closing in, tightening the noose. I decided to end it on my terms. No more digital wars, no more hiding. If he wanted to confront me, I'd give him the chance. I drafted an email from one of my lesser-used aliases, the one tied to the first burner account. It was short, simple, and deliberate. "You want to talk? Meet me where it all started. Midnight, same platform, the subway station, the place where he'd tried to erase me." All day, I prepared. I rented a camera from a pawn shop and wired it to a hidden mic that would record everything. I memorized the angles, the blind spots, the emergency exits. I wasn't going there to kill him. I wanted evidence. Proof of what he'd done, what he'd threatened. If he said the wrong thing, even once, I could finally expose him without damning myself. By the time night fell, the air was heavy with the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. I dressed in black, tied my hair back, and tucked the recorder into my coat pocket. As I made my way down the empty stairwell of the station, Each step echoed like a countdown. The platform was deserted except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint rattle of a distant train. I waited, heart pounding, hands trembling despite my resolve. Then I saw him, Nathan, stepping out of the shadows in a dark coat, his face drawn, eyes burning with something between rage and recognition. The years of ruin had carved lines into him, but his confidence, that terrible confidence, remained. We faced each other in silence, two survivors of the same catastrophe, each holding the other's destruction. When he walked onto that platform again, I knew only one of us would walk away free. It felt like déjà vu, same station, same tension. But this time, I was ready. The air underground carried that familiar metallic tang, the scent of oil and electricity and memory. The tiles on the walls still bore the faint stains from the night he'd shoved me. It had been over a year, but the moment I stepped onto that platform, the past pressed itself against me like static. The cameras I'd set up earlier were live, recording from 3 angles. I wasn't here to relive the trauma, I was here to end it. Nathan emerged from the far end of the platform, his footsteps echoing hollow against the tunnel walls. He looked thinner, more ragged than I remembered, his once polished demeanor eroded by ruin. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a plain black coat that hung loosely from his shoulders. His hair was longer now, unkempt, streaked with gray that hadn't been there before. He stopped several feet away from me, eyes glinting under the harsh fluorescent light. "Lila," he said softly. Hearing my name in his voice felt like glass grinding against bone. "I knew it was you." I didn't answer at first. My hands were steady, though my heart was thrumming like a trapped bird. "You ruined your own life," I said finally. "You did that all by yourself." He laughed. Low, broken. "You think I don't know? You think I haven't spent every night hearing that train in my head? You think I don't see you every time I close my eyes?" He stepped closer, and I could see the veins in his neck, the fury trembling beneath his skin. "You've been following me. You destroyed me." I didn't move. "You tried to kill me," I said evenly. "I just made sure the world saw the man you really are." For a moment, his face softened, a flicker of something human, maybe even regret. "I didn't mean to push you, I swear. It was an accident. I was drunk, angry. You were just there." He exhaled sharply, his voice cracking on the edge of a confession. "I thought if you were gone, maybe it would make the noise stop. I've been paying for that mistake ever since." His words washed over me like poison disguised as apology. "You're not sorry for what you did," I said quietly. "You're sorry you failed." That hit him. His expression shifted, the brief flicker of remorse extinguished by rage. "You think you're better than me? You're just as sick, Lila. You've been stalking me for months, digging through my life, ruining everything I built. You became exactly what you hate." The accusation stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. I saw in his eyes that he knew it too. The line between justice and obsession had long blurred, and he could see the reflection of his own darkness in me. A train rumbled in the distance, its vibration crawling up through the rails. The air grew heavier, trembling with motion. Nathan took another step forward. I could see the flicker of decision in his eyes, that same decision he'd made once before. My muscles tensed. "Don't," I warned. He ignored me. "You think this ends with me?" he hissed. "You think you get to walk away clean after what you've done?" He lunged. The motion wasn't as fast as I remembered. The years had taken their toll, and this time, I was ready. I sidestepped, his hand grazing my coat sleeve instead of my shoulder. He stumbled, nearly losing his footing near the platform edge. The screech of metal grew louder as the train entered the station, its headlights blooming through the tunnel. The gust of air hit us both, sharp and cold. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice lost under the roar. But Nathan wasn't listening. He turned toward me, face contorted in fury and despair. His foot slipped again, and for one awful second, he teetered at the edge, arms flailing for balance. I reached out, instinct or pity, I'll never know. My fingers brushed his sleeve, but he jerked away as if my touch burned. The train was less than a breath away, and then he froze. He looked at me, really looked at me, his eyes wide with something I couldn't read: anger, fear, resignation. Time stretched thin between us, suspended in the shriek of metal and the rush of air. "Go on," he mouthed. "Finish it." But I didn't move. I couldn't. The same instinct that had saved me the first time, that desperate will to live, wouldn't let me become the thing I'd been chasing. The train screamed past, and Nathan staggered backward, collapsing onto the platform instead of under the wheels. The sound of the brakes faded into silence, leaving only the echo of our ragged breathing. He looked up at me, chest heaving, sweat slick on his forehead. "Why didn't you?" he rasped. I stared at him, the fury drained, replaced by something colder. "Because I'm not you," I said. "And I refuse to let you make me that." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The train pulled away, leaving us alone again in the empty station. My camera light blinked softly from its hiding place, recording everything: his confession, his attack, his near fall. Evidence. Finally, the truth. Nathan sat up slowly, his expression a strange mixture of defeat and disbelief. "You think anyone's going to believe you?" he said, weakly. "You've been hiding behind lies." "Maybe," I said, pulling the tiny recorder from my coat pocket. "But this time, the truth's on my side." He looked at the device, his eyes widening as the realization hit. For the first time, I saw fear in him, not anger, not arrogance, but genuine fear. I turned and began to walk toward the exit, each step echoing against the tiled walls. Behind me, I heard him call my name, voice cracking, desperate. But I didn't look back. And for one terrible moment, I had the power to decide whether he lived or died. I could have let him fall. Part of me wanted to. The seconds on the platform stretched until they were elastic and thin, a taut wire pulled tight between impulse and restraint. Nathan teetered with the train, screaming like a beast behind him, and for a breathless instant I understood how small a push would be, how clean and irreversible. My fingers curled, the muscle memory of all the planning and fury coiled like a spring. The part of me that had rehearsed his ruin felt greedy with the possibility of ultimate closure. I felt very close to becoming him. Then, in the raw silence that followed the train's passage, something else moved inside me, not compassion exactly, but a refusal to let murder be my answer. The memory of the first night, of metal and terror and the miraculous filthy safety gap that had spared me, rose in a single bright shard. I had survived because the universe had not wanted me dead that night. I would not become the universe's executioner for someone else's cruelty. I stepped back, my feet uncoiled, practical and obedient, as if another body within me had made the decision for both of us. Nathan collapsed to the tile, chest heaving, the kind of exhausted raggedness you see in bad film after the antagonist finally cracks. He looked at me with a kind of raw, baffled plea, the animal that had been cornered suddenly reduced to pleading. He reached out, voice low. "Please. Please don't make me disappear." I thought of the note on my kitchen table. The photos slid under doors, the videos of my life playing like trophies in his hands. I thought of the scars that would never leave my skin. I thought of the woman who had sat across from me at the charity and trusted me like a friend. The law had the right of it in an ugly way. Taking justice into my own hands would have made me indistinguishable from the man who decided I did not deserve to live that night. I pulled my coat tighter, reached into my pocket for the tiny recorder, and walked toward the stairwell. The call I made from the platform was steady, the dispatcher's voice distant and professional. "There's an assault in progress at the 3rd Street station," I said. And then I handed the phone to the nearest officer, who arrived in a flurry of uniforms and badges because I had timed everything to the peak of public access. When they cuffed Nathan, he shouted and spat and then, incongruously, went still. The charges read like a list of the life he'd tried to erase. Attempted murder, assault, harassment, and later, a stack of corporate crimes my leaks had pried loose. I handed the officer the recorder, the footage of him confessing, lunging, nearly toppling into the path of the train. "We have it all," I said in a voice that surprised me with how calm it sounded. They asked for a statement. I told them the truth, sparing none of the things I'd done to bring him down. I could have lied and kept my methods hidden, but the recorder made the lies unnecessary. When Nathan was led away, his face was a map of something stripped bare, not just fury but defeat, like a man who'd finally met the endpoint of his own arrogance. Our eyes met once, and his were not the bland, clinical stare I'd first seen on the platform that night. They were hollow, rifled through with a kind of stunned, small grief. The police van door slammed, metal bit into metal, and the sound cut off like a stage curtain. In the days that followed, the city hummed with the kind of interest that only a scandal with a violent hook can create. His firm publicly distanced itself, then issued statements about internal investigations. Elise called me from a number I'd saved but never expected to hear from, her voice raw and sincere. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You saved my daughter from whatever that could have been." I thought about telling her everything about the photographs I'd taken, the anonymous emails, the fake accounts, how I'd pushed rumor and truth into a slow collapse, but I didn't. Some truths have edges too sharp to hand to people you care about. Instead, I told her what she needed, that he was in custody, that she and her child were safe. The public record moved quicker than my private reckoning. Nathan was arraigned, bail was denied. Charges stacked into an indictment like bricks. The legal system, messy and slow and imperfect, began its work. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt something like emptiness. The adrenaline that had driven me for months evaporated and left a cavity that echoed. Without the hunt, I had to look at the woman who'd stood at the edge of a platform and decided mercy over murder. I had to wake in the morning and reintroduce myself to a life that did not revolve around dismantling a man. At night, when the city was quiet and the subway's distant hum still set my teeth on edge, I found myself staring at the recorder on my kitchen table, as if the small black device contained the shape of who I'd been and the ruin of who I might become. Justice, it turned out, was a ledger with 2 columns, one for the wrongs done to me and one for the wrongs I'd done in return. I had balanced the books, but the numbers felt wrong. I had rescued myself in a way, yes, and yet part of me still ached with a strange residual ownership that Nathan seemed to hold over my life, a shard lodged inside me that no hand could remove without reopening the wound. Even after his conviction, I couldn't shake the feeling that he still owned a piece of me. Everyone talks about revenge, no one talks about what comes after. The day Nathan was sentenced, the courtroom was cold. The fluorescent lights hummed above us like insects, steady and indifferent. I watched from the back, my palms resting on the edge of the wooden bench, my heartbeat strangely calm. The judge read his crimes one by one: attempted murder, obstruction, fraud. Each charge landed like a muted drumbeat, echoing years of everything I'd carried. When they finally said, "guilty," there was no surge of triumph, no cinematic sense of victory. There was only quiet. Nathan didn't look at me as they led him away. He didn't have to. I saw the slight tremor in his shoulders, the resignation of a man whose arrogance had finally run out of room. For months, I'd dreamed of this moment, imagined his face behind glass, his voice reduced to begging. But when it came, all I felt was exhaustion. I walked out of that courtroom into a city that felt both familiar and foreign. The air tasted cleaner somehow, but empty. I didn't go home right away. I wandered. I passed the cafe where I'd once followed him, the park where I'd filmed him drinking alone, the charity office where Elise had smiled at me as though I were someone worth trusting. Each place felt haunted by an echo of myself, the hunter, the avenger, the woman who couldn't let go. Weeks passed. The noise of the trial faded into background chatter. Headlines shifted to new scandals, new villains. Nathan became just another name in a string of forgotten cautionary tales. For everyone else, it was over. For me, it was only beginning. I moved to another city, a smaller one, quieter, where the subway tunnels didn't hum beneath every street. I found an apartment with windows that opened to trees instead of traffic. I started therapy. At first, the silence felt unbearable, like withdrawal. For years, my thoughts had revolved around one man, one wound. Without him, there was nothing but space, and in that space lived the memories I'd kept buried beneath purpose. My therapist was a soft-spoken woman named Ellen. She didn't ask for the whole story at once. She let me build it piece by piece, like a puzzle I'd been too afraid to assemble. Sometimes I hated her for her patience. Sometimes I cried without knowing why. She told me something that lingered. When you survive something like that, part of you gets trapped in the moment. The rest of you spends years trying to go back and free her. I started writing again, not emails or revenge logs, but real writing. At first, it was just journal entries, scattered thoughts about fear and power, about how easy it is for pain to disguise itself as purpose. Then, on a whim, I posted one anonymously online. It wasn't confessional, it was reflective. I wrote about surviving violence, about rebuilding identity, about what justice really costs. I didn't mention names or specifics, but the post went viral anyway. Messages flooded in from strangers, women and men who had survived their own traumas, people who'd been silenced, disbelieved, dismissed. For the first time, I wasn't alone in my pain. I began corresponding with them, helping where I could, listening where I couldn't. Slowly, purpose replaced obsession. I started volunteering at a local outreach center, using what I'd learned: the psychology of fear, the fragile art of rebuilding. I wasn't Lila the survivor or Lila the avenger anymore. I was just Lila. But healing is never linear. There were nights when I woke drenched in sweat, certain I'd heard footsteps outside my door. The creak of pipes still made my body seize with memory. I could be standing in a crowded grocery store and, just for a second, the smell of cologne would send me spiraling back into that subway tunnel. Trauma doesn't ask permission to revisit you. It slips in quietly, wearing the scent of familiarity. Still, I kept moving forward. I learned to measure progress in breaths, not milestones. To sit with silence without mistaking it for danger. To look at my reflection without seeing the ghost of who I'd been. Then one night, months after the sentencing, I came home to find a letter slipped under my door. No postage, no sender. My heart stopped. For a long moment, I just stared at it, too afraid to touch it. Finally, I tore it open. It contained only a single line, typed in the same cold, indifferent font as the note I'd once found on my kitchen table. "You think I'm gone?" I read it twice. My hands shook, but the fear didn't take hold the way it used to. The old me would have packed a bag, moved again, erased herself completely. The new me simply folded the paper, placed it in a drawer, and locked it away. Because I knew something now that I hadn't before. Monsters don't always die when they're caged. Sometimes, they linger in the corners of your mind. In the places that used to hurt. But they don't own you anymore unless you let them. That night, I opened my window and let the wind fill the room. I listened to the faint sound of the city breathing cars, sirens, laughter, life continuing as it always had. I was part of it again. The scars were still there, but they no longer dictated who I was. That's when I realized survival wasn't a single victory, it was a lifetime of vigilance. When ghosts return, they never come quietly. I was walking home from the community center one late autumn evening when I saw him. At first, I thought my mind was playing a cruel trick, a figure standing across the street under a flickering streetlight, tall, familiar, still as a photograph. The cold wind whipped against my face as I blinked, heart pounding. But when a car passed and its headlights swept across him, I saw the truth I didn't want to see: Nathan Cole. It had been nearly a year since his conviction. I'd read in passing that he'd been transferred to a lower security facility after good behavior. It hadn't seemed possible that he could be free already. But there he was, thinner, sharper, his once immaculate posture bent slightly, like life had sanded him down to the barest version of himself. Our eyes met across the street, and the city's hum dimmed to a single, terrible note. He didn't move toward me, he just smiled, a faint, knowing curve of the mouth that carried no warmth at all. Then, as the traffic light changed, he turned and walked away, swallowed by the crowd. I stood frozen, every instinct screaming to run, to vanish. Instead, I forced myself to breathe. I reminded myself that I wasn't the same woman he'd shoved onto the tracks. I had survived, I had rebuilt. Still, that night, I double-checked the locks, the windows, the shadows. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I searched for confirmation. I called the district office, posing as a journalist. They hesitated before confirming what I already feared. Nathan Cole had been released early for cooperative testimony in another case. He was out, free. The news sent a tremor through the life I'd carefully rebuilt. For days, I looked over my shoulder without meaning to. I told myself that running again would only give him what he wanted. But fear has its own rhythm. It settles beneath the skin until even peace feels dangerous. 2 weeks later, I saw him again. Not in the shadows this time, but in broad daylight. I was volunteering at the shelter when I noticed a familiar car parked across the street. It wasn't his Nathan. Never drove anything modest, but the man behind the wheel had his build, his stillness, his watchfulness. When I stepped outside, the car pulled away. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I contacted Elise. It had been months since we'd spoken, and I didn't know if she'd want to hear from me. But when I told her Nathan was out, there was only silence on the line, then a soft, trembling breath. "He called last week," she said. "He wanted to see our daughter." I told him no. But he sounded different. Empty. Empty. The word lodged itself in my mind. I wondered if emptiness made him more dangerous or less. That night, I sat with my laptop open, scrolling through local news archives. There it was, a brief, almost hidden report. Disgraced attorney Nathan Cole released after aiding federal investigation. No mention of me, no mention of his past violence. Just another man re-entering society. Anger replaced fear. Men like him always found a way to return, polished and pitied. I couldn't let him slither back into the world unchallenged. But this time, I wasn't driven by vengeance. It wasn't about destroying him anymore. It was about ensuring no one else fell into his orbit. Through contacts at an online publication, survivors I'd met through my writing, I passed along his name, his history, the sealed details of his case. The story gained quiet traction. A journalist started digging deeper, uncovering inconsistencies in his testimony, whispers of manipulation even behind bars. Within days, the internet murmured with the story of a man who had cooperated his way to freedom. Then came the knock at my door. It was late, close to midnight. I froze, every nerve screaming. Through the peephole, I saw him again. Nathan. Standing in the hallway, his hands at his sides, expression calm. "Lila," he said through the door. Voice muffled but steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." I didn't answer. "I wanted to say I understand now," he continued. "I know what it's like to lose everything. You took everything from me and I took something from you. We're even." He paused, a faint laugh escaping him, dry, humorless. "Except, maybe, we never will be." I didn't open the door. I didn't speak. Eventually, his footsteps faded down the hall, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound. The next day, I called the journalist again and told them everything: the push, the threats, the surveillance, the confrontation. They listened, recorded, and within a week, a new story broke. Former lawyer under investigation for violating release conditions. Nathan's name flooded the headlines once more. This time, there would be no escaping it. I watched the report from my couch, my coffee cold in my hand. A part of me felt vindicated. Another part just felt tired. A few days later, they caught him at the airport, trying to board a flight under an alias. He didn't resist arrest. The news played footage of him being led away, a hollow shell of the man I'd once feared. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at anyone. As I watched, something inside me settled, not in triumph but in closure. The circle was complete. Seeing him dragged away one last time, I finally understood revenge was never power. It was closure. I used to think survival was just breathing, now I know it's transformation. Months passed after Nathan's second arrest, and the city began to feel alive again in a way it hadn't for years. The world outside my window no longer looked like a threat but like a place I could rejoin. I'd spent so long waiting for the next shadow, the next echo of his presence, that the quiet felt foreign, suspicious even before it started to feel like peace. I went back to work at the design firm I'd once abandoned. The first week was strange, like trying to fit into a version of myself that no longer existed. My coworkers noticed the difference, the stillness in me, the careful way I spoke, as if every word had to earn its place. I didn't tell them what had happened. The story belonged to me now, and I wasn't ready to share it with people who'd only see tragedy where I saw evolution. I kept writing in my spare hours essays, reflections, fragments of memory turned into art. I stopped using aliases. My name appeared beside my words for the first time in years, and each publication felt like reclaiming a piece of the identity Nathan had tried to erase. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd become visible again through the very act of storytelling, something he could never take from me. Sometimes, people reached out to thank me. Survivors. Strangers. Women who said my words helped them speak theirs aloud. I always replied, though never with grand advice, just with the truth, that healing isn't about forgetting, it's about coexisting with the memory and choosing not to let it define your future. Each time I sent those words, I felt them settle a little deeper inside myself. Then, one afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since the night of the attack. I rode the subway. It was a small decision, unplanned. I was on my way to meet a client across town when traffic stalled. The entrance to the station yawned before me, cold, echoing, familiar. For a moment, I hesitated on the steps, fingers gripping the rail. The smell of the tunnels hit me like a wave. Metal, oil, faint electricity. My pulse jumped. I almost turned back, but then I took a breath, descended, and stepped onto the platform. The tiles were the same. The hum of the tracks, the distant rumble of approaching trains, all unchanged. But I wasn't. I walked to the exact spot where he'd shoved me. My reflection shimmered faintly in the darkened tunnel window, and I realized I didn't see fear there anymore. I saw endurance. I whispered to the empty air, not a prayer, not a curse, just acknowledgement. You didn't win. The words weren't for Nathan anymore. They were for the version of myself who had fallen that night, the woman who thought her story had ended there. The train arrived, roaring and bright. I stepped inside, the doors slid shut, sealing me into a capsule of light and motion. I didn't tremble. I didn't flinch. I watched the tunnel blur past, my reflection superimposed over it, a ghost that had finally made peace with the living. As the city moved around me, I realized that revenge hadn't freed me, survival had. Revenge was a chain disguised as a weapon, binding me to him long after he was gone. But survival, quiet and persistent, was rebellion in its purest form. Every breath I took, every morning I woke without dread, was a defiance greater than any ruin I'd ever orchestrated. In therapy, Ellen once told me, "Closure isn't the end of a story, Lila. It's the point where you stop writing for them and start writing for yourself." I hadn't understood it then. Now, standing on the other side of everything, I did. I started volunteering more often, not as a way to atone but as a way to contribute. I worked with other survivors, people whose pain mirrored mine in shape but not in story. We didn't trade horror for pity, we traded survival for strength. In helping them, I learned to help myself. The circle of pain had finally widened into something else: empathy. One evening, after a long shift at the shelter, I took the subway home again. The city lights flickered through the windows, painting my reflection in fractured gold. I thought of Nathan briefly, not with hatred, not even with sorrow, but with distance. He was part of the story that had made me who I was, but he no longer defined it. He was a closed chapter, a lesson written in scar tissue. When the train reached my stop, I stepped out and walked up into the cool night air. The streets buzzed softly with life, people talking, traffic humming, laughter spilling from open doors. I stood there for a while, letting the sounds wash over me. I felt alive in a way I hadn't since before it all began. Before heading home, I turned once more toward the direction of the subway entrance. The same wind that had once carried my scream now brushed gently across my face. I smiled, not in triumph, not in nostalgia, but in quiet gratitude for the strength I'd found in the ruins. Because the best revenge isn't his ruin, it's my peace.